Good afternoon, dear Rudy. Please tell me and our viewers and readers about how the American media cover the events taking place in Ukraine.
All right. Yes, I will, Mira. And before I get into that, I just wanted to say that in order to discuss the American media, I think your viewers need to understand that the American media is dictated on certain stories, how they will report on things by the federal government and the Central Intelligence Agency. And so, you know, it is often said that the first casualty of war is the truth. And I think that's the case here. Even before the conflict began, and this has been my experience in, living in America and, being a citizen of this country, the United States government, and this may be shocking, and I'm going to say some shocking things today, and I pray that your listeners will give me a chance to provide some information that backs up what I'm about to say. But I believe that the United States government is currently led by a bunch of godless, lying, murderous psychopaths who place no value on human life, whether they are Russian or American, when it comes to furthering their own agenda. Do not underestimate how evil the American government has become now that their actions, are being exposed for the world to see. I'm no expert on Putin, and I don't claim to be an expert on Putin or his history or what this man is in his heart. But when he refers to America as an empire of lies, Putin is exactly correct. And I'll say this too, based on my experience in, evaluating the society around me, there is a percentage of Christians who are suspicious of all the leaders of the world, including Putin and including like every country, that they're concerned they're working behind the scenes, regardless of any external conflicts that may appear to be the case, that they're working behind the scenes with Klaus Schwab, people like him, the World Economic Forum, to bring about a new world order. And so they believe that the world is moving in that direction to bring about a social credit system where dissidents and people who go against the establishment are not allowed. Very similar to what exists in China today. I will say that in America, under the guise of COVID, that we have lost a tremendous amount of freedoms in this country just recently. Being forced vaccinated, or you lose your job. People are not able to participate. Their accounts are being shut down. Their bank accounts are being shut down. And so the American government constantly needs to instill fear in the American people in order to control them. And we're seeing that happen over and over again. False flags are a common tool of the American government. And for people that have eyes to see and ears to hear, we recognize what's going on. Now, getting back to the Ukraine and say, how is the American media reporting on Ukraine? So I want to make it clear that the American media is notorious, absolutely notorious, for propaganda and censorship. That did not used to be the case, several years ago, but it is now. They're censoring anybody who doesn't go along with the establishment. You can't post on social media. You're deleted. Your Twitter accounts are deleted. They even deleted the Twitter account of the previous president, Donald Trump. So in regards to the Ukraine situation, the mainstream media is only giving us one choice. And that choice is hate Putin. Think of him as a tyrant who's anti-freedom, anti-American. Support Ukraine, who they promote as being, freedom fighters that want their independence. You either pick that or you stand as a traitor to America. I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but one of the things that he did is he called out fake news, and that resonated with a large segment of the American population. The problem, I believe, Mira, is that the American people can't fathom just how much fake news they're being inundated with on a daily basis. They understand there are some fake news, but I believe it's much bigger than they currently can imagine. And I want to bring this to your viewership as well. The father of American propaganda is a man by the name of Edward Bernays. I encourage your readers and your listeners to research him. And he put forward the idea that you can manipulate human behavior by putting forth propaganda. And that he also put forth the idea that typically propaganda is considered a bad thing. It's deceptive, it's lying, it's typically considered a negative thing. But he put forward the idea that under certain conditions, like a forced campaign to do forced vaccinations or even a war, propaganda is a good thing when it's deemed appropriate by the government. And so I believe our government is operating under this guise that propaganda is good because they're trying to manipulate the American public. Now, if it's like there's always a boogeyman in America, whether it be Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, now it's war with Russia. It was COVID not too long ago. And so they always need this distraction. And so the war with Russia is the new distraction. I'm going to recommend one more thing before we go on to the next question, Mira, and that is there is a book that was written by John Perkins, and the book is titled Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And in that book, he's an insider. He worked for the inside government in America, and he would go to different countries. And he said there was a plan that they followed every time. And he said we would first try to bribe the leader of the other country to do our interest. If we couldn't bribe them, we will intimidate them or assassinate them. And then the next step is if we can't intimidate them or assassinate them, we will do a false flag military operation against that country. And he writes about his actions as an economic hitman, and America has been meddling in the leadership of other countries for decades all over the world. And so it was almost laughable when the Democrats claimed Russia was trying to meddle in American elections with Donald Trump doing Russian collusion. So we're not given much of a choice with the American mainstream media. The choice that most people hear, as they go about their daily lives, is Putin is a tyrant and we need to stand with Ukraine. So that kind of is my answer to that question. Yes.
Got it. It's obvious that the Western media have united in their information war against Russia. Kiev fakes are broadcast all over the world. Russia is exposed as a real tyrant. Do you think the world community has finally waited for the moment to bring down its Russophobic propaganda?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mira. From your perspective, because you live in Russia and you have the Russian perspective, you see it very clearly. But again, from living in the West, when we drive down a busy highway in Dallas, Texas, there's a car dealership and they're flying these huge mega flags, and they'll have an American flag, a Ukraine flag, an American flag, a Ukraine flag, and it goes on for a long time. And every radio station is promoting stand with Ukraine. All right. And so when you talk about Russia-phobic propaganda and how the Russians have been made the bad guys, you clearly see that because you've paid attention and you see, and I think I'm familiar with some of the videos that you're referencing where it's obvious these videos are faked. But most Americans don't see that, right? So when I want to go back to where Putin called America an empire of lies, he's absolutely right. We live in an empire of lies in America. And I encourage your listeners to research a topic called Operation Mockingbird. I think I mentioned it before, but the CIA not only controls the media, but they've influenced several Hollywood movies, and they always promote a pro-American government narrative. And for some reason, the American government needs to make a boogeyman out of Russia. And so they do that to instill fear, whether it be war propaganda. They've got to have somebody that is the enemy. And so you see that over and over again in America. There's little to no real journalism in America that's left. Everybody just follows the government narrative. I will say this, for those few people that are willing to speak up, if they become popular, you've often heard America is the land of free speech. And that's true to some degree. You can stand on the corner and you can typically say whatever you want to say and nobody will bother you. The problem is if you get popular, if you start saying things and you get a following, that's where the government moves in. They'll first try to censor you, and if you can overcome the censorship, they will imprison you, and then they will eventually kill you. So that's not an exaggeration. There's many doctors that have mysteriously ended up dead because they speak out against the establishment narrative on certain things regarding this COVID thing. So I encourage your listeners not only to look up Operation Mockingbird, but to research this phrase here. Sinclair broadcast same message. Sinclair broadcast same message. What they will see is the local news stations. I'm not talking about mainstream news that goes across the country. I'm talking about the local news stations that people, think are just local news reporters they're being fed scripts by Sinclair Media Broadcasting, and they're reading these scripts all over the country, verbatim, and they're just parroting a story that comes from headquarters. And this was exposed in the Sinclair Broadcasting Group. And so it's very difficult to get a story out. I'm going to give you an example too. Let's say that you want to get a story out that goes against the establishment. And I'm going to give an example where I recently saw a movie on the Ukraine because I was trying to educate myself about the Ukraine. Oliver Stone came out with a movie called Ukraine on Fire. I watched it on YouTube.
I can't even open it.
There you go. There you go.
You sent me that link and I can't even open it.
There you go, Mira. You can't even open it. So when I watched it on YouTube, it had several thousand views and it was gaining in popularity. And YouTube has now deleted that documentary that Oliver Stone did. And now you have to go look on alternative websites. And so, the majority of people, if you don't have a strong relationship with God, and they see a conflict happening, whether it be a conflict between Russia and America or any conflict, Democrats, Republicans, they feel compelled to pick a side and they look for things that they have in common. But sometimes we need to evaluate the situation and understand the history, understand what's going on, understand the Ukrainian history. And I think that's what Oliver Stone was trying to do in his documentary, is to give us a history on NATO encroachment into the Ukraine, the proliferation of nuclear weapons right up to the border of Russia, how Russia had stated several times they don't agree with what NATO is doing in Ukraine. We had this this thing that happened in Maidan, I believe, where there was a pro-Russian leader that was overturned and Western influence came in and helped make that happen. And that was again, another example where the West is meddling in elections in parts of the world they don't need to be meddling. And so all of this stuff, if you don't have a strong relationship with God, you don't necessarily always have to pick a side. You have to investigate the issue and educate yourself. And I'm concerned that the American media is just putting forward one side of the story. And when you say you can't even bring up the video anymore, I want to share with you, Mira, and I think this is important for you to know. Your website, Foundation to Battle Injustice, that is a powerful website which advocates for prisoners around the world, including America. And Amy Gonzalez, which is a close friend of mine, when you published her story, she broke down in tears of joy that somebody is finally publishing her story to the world. Well, I tried to publish Amy's story on your website on Facebook, which is obviously the biggest social media platform in the world. Your website is banned on Facebook. They won't allow anything from your website, including Amy, to be published on social media. So it's just another example of, how the Western media and big tech and the government not only implements propaganda, but also censorship. And they have a strong arm on the freedom of the American people. And I think most people don't even understand that because they don't investigate things. They just listen to the radio and they live their lives and they're not really looking deeply into the matter.
What has been happening on the territory of Donbass for the last 8 years is a real war crime. The Ukrainian army literally staged a genocide of the Russian-speaking population. Why did the hypocritical Western media remain silent all this time and did not cover what was happening?
Again, I'm going to go back to the fact that it's not in the interest of the American government to have that story get out. It goes against their narrative that there's a genocide of Russian-speaking population. And so I think people that are similar, and I'm not, lifting up Oliver Stone, but for people that want that story to get out, I can only see two ways in the current environment. One way is a blogger who's close to the situation and has the truth, such as what we're doing here, such as, what you're doing on your YouTube channel until they take you down, Mira. You're putting out the truth and planting seeds. You're a journalist, so you're reporting on, you're interviewing various people, you're getting various perspectives. But somebody who may have the truth of the genocide of Russian-speaking people, either they need to blog about it in hopes that it will go viral, in hopes that they can back up some of the claims that they're making, or have somebody that has, movie-making skills to make a documentary so that we can share this documentary for the people that are willing to go beyond, the parroting media in the Western media. So there's lots of stories. When you say, why are they not covering the genocide of Russian-speaking peoples in the, in the Ukrainian, by the Ukrainian army, I would say there's lots of stories that have been ignored by the Western media that involve significant world events that simply are not reported, and that's unfortunately a very common thing. Whatever I want your listeners to get, in regards to listening to our conversation, what they may think I'm exaggerating on how bad the Western media is. I haven't gone far enough. It really is that bad. Our Western media is so controlled and so censored and so propagandized, it's very difficult for anything against the establishment to get out. And if people do put anything against the establishment, they're branded a traitor to the country. And so it takes a very special individual to speak against the establishment. And so right now, the main thing in America is stand with Ukraine. Putin is a horrible tyrant, and he's murdering. Let me share this with you too, Mira. Just recently, in the past few days, one of the main stories on Drudge Report, which is a main news outlet in America, is that Russian soldiers are cutting the tongues out of Ukrainian people and leaving their dead bodies thrown all over the street. Russian soldiers are raping mothers and daughters in front of each other, and I don't believe none of that. But that's the kind of propaganda that's being sent into the American minds, and unfortunately, it's very difficult to overcome that. When my father told me back in World War II that the government would show the Japanese throwing babies up in the air and catching them on a bayonet in order to dehumanize the Japanese. And so what's happening is you're seeing a massive effort with the Western media to dehumanize Russian military and Putin. They really, really don't like Putin. And I have some ideas on why they're doing that and why they hate him so much, but maybe that will be a future question.
Okay. How would you comment on the recent statement by the recognized in Russia extremist organization Meta about violence against Russian servicemen? How does a company that is considered one of the main censors of the internet allow itself such statements?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And I'll say this, in the early days of the internet, because, I've been involved with the internet since the very beginning. I worked for Cisco Systems for 20 years, and they were a company that helped build the internet, right? I was involved from the very beginning in my career. And so it would be unthinkable that big tech companies like Google, Facebook, YouTube, and others would censor, that sort of behavior or try to control people's speech. But in regards to Meta, and I think there was an article that came out on Reuters, it was a news article that said, under the current conditions, they will allow statements of violence on Facebook towards Russian military men and towards Putin, and they're not going to take off those statements of violence. In other words, if you want to call for violence against the Russian military men or Putin, go ahead and do it all you want to. We're not going to censor you like we censor other people. And I consider that an incredibly hypocritical thing. It goes along with the propaganda of the American government, and it goes to show you that big tech and American government are working hand in hand to push their agenda. And it's incredibly unethical. It's incredibly hypocritical, and it's just for anybody that is, has any sort of common sense or ethics, you realize how bad it is. And so, I think this whole thing about the Russian collusion with Donald Trump, right? That was a big thing by the Democrats, and so they pushed that as well. And it's like they almost project onto their enemies what they do themselves. And so if they project, that Russians are meddling in American elections, well, the truth is that Americans have meddled in elections all over the world. We are guilty of it bigger than any other country. And so it's almost laughable that, certain segments of the federal government in America would say that, the Russians were trying to meddle in an American election. And so I do want to say this too, in regards to that question on why they may be targeting Putin. And this is One of the books that changed my life, Mira, was a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And it gave me an idea about fiat money. And it changed my whole worldview on what real money is and the power that people have, that specifically the bankers, when they can make money, just create it as much as they want to. And so when I realized that, and I gave a new perspective on fiat money, we used to be on what's called the gold standard. And from my understanding on the news articles I've read recently, Putin has recently declared that Russian oil must be paid for in Russian rubles. He's also tied the Russian ruble to the gold standard. That is a very significant thing, because the root of the bankers' power, the bankers, I believe, that control the elite and American government, the root of their power is control of the petrodollar and the American dollar over the world. And if you have a ruble that's tied to gold, and I've heard recently that the ruble is soaring, that the value of the ruble is actually going up. And so I believe that was a very smart move by Putin. And I believe that one of the things the Bible tells us is that the love of money is the root of all evil. It also says that God hates unjust weights. It's an abomination. And that honest money system is an incredibly important thing for the fairness of mankind, for the justice of mankind. And the way they manipulate human behavior across the world is they have control of a dishonest money system. And regardless of what I may or may not know about Putin, I do applaud him moving the ruble to the gold standard, and I do applaud him going back to an honest money system. And I pray that it's not just a temporary thing, you know, for show. I pray that it is a permanent thing.
Thank you. Amen. Just the other day, President Joe Biden's job approval rating collapsed to 40%, which was the lowest figure during his leadership. Do you think Americans have realized that because of the actions of the Biden administration, the world is facing a crisis in the coming years?
Okay, so you've referenced, Mira, his low approval rating, and I'm going to throw another thought in there, and it's, you know, from your perspective, or maybe from people that are like where Ukraine, the Ukraine war, the Ukraine conflict, whatever you want to term it, it's very high in their mind. But from an American perspective, the typical American, the Ukraine thing, it is being inundated in mainstream news. But I would say that the most important thing that the typical American goes through in their daily lives is they're paying an enormous gas prices, all right, much more so than normal. And the food prices in the grocery stores are going through the roof. And the average American is very upset about that. I mean, it's unfortunate, right? But the average American doesn't really pay attention to global news on what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in Africa or what's going on. You know, we're very centric about ourselves. It's a very selfish country typically. And so we're upset we got to pay high gas prices. We're upset that we got to, you know, pay high grocery prices. And that's probably contributing to his low approval rating more so than what he's done with the war in Ukraine. And I would say that the typical American doesn't believe that Biden has escalated the crisis. They don't understand the encroachment of the NATO. They don't understand that, you know, I believe Zelensky was talking about proliferating nuclear weapons right on the border of, you know, Russia. So I want to talk about war again, you know, before I lose this thought in my mind. There was a Marine named General Smedley Butler. He was at the time he was alive, he was the most decorated Marine in United States history. And he spent his entire career as a well, you know, disciplined, and he had more medals, more decorations. He was very well respected. And he wrote a book, Mira, and it's called War is a Racket. It's not very long. It's a very short book. But in the book, he says that all wars are done for profit, and that most of the time that corporations work with governments to use military men to further their profit motives. And this was a shocking thing for the most well-respected, decorated military man in America to do, is to say that, you know, wars are for profit, and they're done at the behest of corporations and governments. And so I recommend your readers seek out that book. It's not a very long book. And he really tells the truth about war being a racket, and it's driven by corporations and governments for profit motives, not necessarily for what we're being told in the media. So I don't think that the Americans like Biden. They're probably believing the propaganda about what they're being told with Ukraine and Russia, but they're probably more upset with Biden because of high gas prices and high food prices.
I bet. How do American conservatives feel about the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine by the Biden administration?
Okay, that's a great question. So I would say American conservatives are split. You have the ones that, let me share this thought. I'm going to hopefully remember it properly. Wars are began when your government tells you who the enemy is. Right now, our government is telling us that Russia is the enemy, right? So wars are began when your government tells you who the enemy is. And then the second part of that, Mira, is revolutions occur when you figure it out yourself. So in the American Revolution, I believe that the Americans who founded this country, they figured it out themselves who the enemy was. They weren't told by their government who to go fight. So when I say that the conservatives are split, there are some that are deep thinkers that look at, in other words, they'll go seek out Putin's speech on February the 24th, the day of the invasion of Ukraine. I think there was a war rally in Crimea where Putin got up in front of a large cheering crowd and he gave a speech. Well, a clear thinking individual would want to go find out what Putin said and listen and find a transcript. Now, I got to tell you, Mira, it's very difficult as an English speaker to find out, to find these transcripts of Putin's speech. They're always making it very difficult to find. So the conservatives that don't do a lot of deep thinking, that just listen to the radio, listen to Fox News, listen to CNN, they're the ones when they're driving down the busy road and they go by the car dealership and they see the American flag and the Ukrainian flag, and it's just row after row of Ukrainian flag. They're like, I want to support my country, and my country tells me to support Ukraine, right? And so they don't view it as Biden escalating the war in Ukraine. They don't view it like that at all. They've been told that Putin is the aggressor, and Putin is the one that we need to, hate, and he doesn't deserve our support, and we're sanctioning his daughters now. So, it's only the small minority that can go beyond the propaganda. And so when you say, how do the conservatives view Biden escalating the war in Ukraine, most conservatives don't view it like that at all. They have been told to believe by their government that Putin is the aggressor and that we need to support Ukraine. And if anybody wants to see that picture of the Dallas automobile, dealership where they're flying many giant Ukrainian flags, I thought it was shocking because I think it's like it shows a disrespect to the American flag to fly a Ukrainian flag at the same level. But that's the kind of mentality that's going on in America. And if you're not living here and you're not exposed to it, it may be a surprise, but that's exactly what's going on in our country.
The recent statement by the leader of the United States about the president of the Russian Federation exacerbates the discussion about the health of 79-year-old Democratic President Joe Biden, in particular about the decline in his cognitive functions. What do you think about this?
Very good question. So many people are questioning the cognitive abilities of Joe Biden. I believe that Joe Biden is a puppet and that he was not legally elected. Now, I'm not the only one that believes that. I was watching the election, the night of the election. I was paying very close attention. And there was a time where I thought that Donald Trump would win for sure. That it's like it looked very clear that he had the win, sealed up. And then all of a sudden, election polling stations shut down all over the country. They had to close for whatever reasons, and then they reopened. And then all of a sudden, we're told that Joe Biden won the election when the mail-in votes were counted. So I believe that Biden has been selected, that he's a puppet. He's very controllable. I believe he does have diminished cognitive abilities, but I don't believe he's actually the one that's making the decisions. Now, the fact that I don't believe that he legitimately won the election, I'm not the only one that believes that. There is a great percentage of the American people that hold that same opinion. Election fraud is being capitalized on by people like Mike Lindell. And for your viewers that may be listening that don't know Mike Lindell, I encourage you to go check him out. Here's the deal. Unfortunately, he has a big following. He sells pillows, he sells books, he's got a website called frankspeech.com, and he gives a lot of speeches, and supposedly he has a tremendous amount of evidence that proves election fraud. I also agree there's election fraud. My concern is people coming into the movement that promote a certain truth, and it is true, I do believe there is election fraud, but instead of promoting it for the sake of getting the truth out so we can do something which will change, actually make a positive change, they use it to make money, right? It's like we all agree it's raining. We all agree there's a thunderstorm. Well, I'm going to sell you an umbrella. It isn't going to stop the fact it's raining, but I made a little money because I'm selling umbrellas. I don't want to make money in the destruction of the world and the destruction of my country. I want there to be real change that changes our country. And if there is election fraud, the people who implemented election fraud should be held accountable and tried for treason. And so I'm concerned that Mike Lindell makes a lot of over-the-top statements that are simply not true, but it's very self-serving. Now, I do agree with Mike Lindell that there was election fraud, but I'm concerned that he's putting forth the idea just to make money. Now, that's a very controversial statement, what I just said, but that's my opinion nonetheless. I do applaud Mike Lindell in the evidence that he's collected. And going back to your question, I consider Joe Biden incompetent, controllable, and a puppet. That's what I could think about Joe Biden.
Thank you. Due to the Western agenda in the media, the attitude towards Russian-speaking residents of Europe and the United States has noticeably worsened. Employees are fired, students are expelled from universities, and children are bullied just because they're Russian. Why do you think, who do you think benefits from inciting hatred towards Russians?
Okay. I'm gonna answer your question by going to some passages in the Bible, because that's a powerful question that you asked. Who benefits from inciting hatred towards Russians, right? Inciting hatred towards Russians is a despicable thing, but it's one tool in the tool bag of the people that control the levers of the world to cause division among humanity. In the Bible, especially specifically Revelation 13, it does talk about a one world government, and it talks about three pieces to that government. One of them is a one world government. It said that the Antichrist is given power over all nations, people, and kindreds. It also talks about a one world religion in Revelation 13. I believe it's 13:15. Revelation 13:15, it says everybody will be made to bow down to the Antichrist. And then it also talks about a one world financial system. If you don't have the mark of the beast, you won't be able to buy or sell. So we have three parts. We have a one world government, a one world leader, we have a one world religion, and we have a one world financial system. In other words, everything is centered on those three things that make a new world order. And so this division that's being created is to break down the existing order. In other words, right now, we have Russia as a sovereign country. You have your own military, you have your own people, you have your own culture. And America, we have our own military, we have our own culture, as wicked as it may be at times. And then other countries have their own military. The elite that run the world, they don't want separate militaries. They don't want separate governments. They want everything to be under one government. And there was a book written by an officer that's now died of cancer. His name is Officer Jack McLamb. The book was called Operation Vampire Killer. And he predicted in his book that the United Nations will at some point request that all the militaries of the world be brought under them. Now, this is a shocking statement to hear for the first time. But as you see where the world is going, you can see this happening more and more. That what the United Nations will do is they'll say, if you give us control of all the militaries of the world, what we'll give you in turn is a world court. And any differences or conflicts between Russia and America or China or the Ukraine, we'll resolve those conflicts in a world court, and there'll be no more need for war. And so what you're doing is you're giving up your freedom and your sovereignty to control your own destiny as their country, and we're giving that over to a United Nations. And I see the world moving to that. Will it happen next year, 20 years? I don't know. But I do see that there are people pushing for a one world order where there will be no Russian military, and there will be no American military. It will all be controlled, and they'll claim that, you know, they'll give us this court. Now, who benefits from inciting hatred to Russians? Well, when I view Putin, right, I see one of two things happening, and this is my perspective, and I'm open to being educated, right? Either Putin really is standing against this because he wants to maintain the sovereignty and the freedom of his country, and he really is moving his monetary system back to a gold standard, which is an honest money system, and he has sincere wishes of goodness for his country in his heart. That's one possibility. The other possibility is he's playing the role of an actor under the leadership of this one world order, under Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, to play this role to usher in this new world order. Now, I don't know, Mira. I can't look into the heart of Putin. I hope that it's the former. I hope that he's standing for the goodness of his country and the sovereignty of his country, that you guys and everybody, every country can direct your own destiny without being under the control of a one world order. But when you ask me the question, who benefits from incitement of hatred, it's like they have to tear down the existing establishment to bring about the one world order that they want to do. And so they benefit, the people who want to bring about the one world order, which I ultimately believe will be the Antichrist discussed in the book of Revelations.
The current US administration allocates billions of dollars for arming and training the Ukrainian army, while there are many problems within its own country that require attention. For example, police or judicial abuse, as well as the situation with penitentiary institutions, which we have repeatedly talked about. Why does the current American establishment put foreign policy interests above the interests of its own people? And I'm not even talking about the health situation, education situation, and so on.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question, and a question that many people ask. My dad asked similar questions when he was alive, not necessarily to why they're spending money in Ukraine, but why would they spend money on these other activities rather than the interest of the American people. So I'm going to go back to this book that changed my life and how I view world economics. And it's called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And it talks about the world fiat money system. And so this idea that you're putting forth in your question, that they're taking money from the American people that could be used to benefit the American people, and they're using it to further their interest by arming the Ukrainian military. I want to offer a different way to think about that, right? And I'm gonna even like tell you a story. When my dad was alive, he would watch television, and he hated the fact that the federal government would subsidize abortions in America. He didn't like the fact that his tax dollars were used for Planned Parenthood for abortions. And I would tell my dad, I would say, because the American government has the capacity and the capability to print and to create unlimited money, right? It's like they're not limited by the tax dollars they collect from me. In other words, when the American government decides to do something or to not do something, whether it be arm the Ukrainian military or provide money for abortions by giving money to Planned Parenthood, they do it. They don't care if there's money that's been collected by the American taxpayer. They have the ability to create money basically out of thin air, since they have a hegemony on American dollar, and they go and do whatever they want to do that promotes their agenda. Now, you say, well, why do they collect tax dollars from the American people? What's the point in that? The reason they collect tax dollars from the American people is to financially oppress us and to keep us financially insignificant. They don't want us to be prosperous and free and have extra time on our hands to research into the Ukrainian military conflict. They don't want us to research into 9/11 or look into Obama's birth certificate or look at international news and become educated. They want us working all the time, paying high prices for our food, high prices for our gas. And so they tax the heck out of us, not because they need the money.
They keep you busy.
Right. And so it's like when I view your question, it's like they're not taking from us to arm the military of Ukraine. They're going to arm the military of Ukraine anyway. They've got unlimited money. They tax us simply to keep us busy, like you said. And so, unfortunately, that's how evil this fiat money system is, and why it's so powerful that Putin went back to a gold-based standard. I didn't think I would ever see that in my lifetime. And if he really did do that, and I'm really reading these reports properly, I got to say I applaud that. I'm very much applaud any leader in the world moving their currency to a gold-based standard. It's very admirable, and it's a kick in the teeth to the bankers who influence world leaders.
What do you think is the real interest of the Biden administration in financing the Ukrainian army? Are they trying their best to hide and protect what is actually happening in American biochemical labs?
All right. So when it comes to it, I have heard reports of the biochemical laboratories, and I'm going to bring up this example to show the hypocrisy of the United States. Your listeners may remember this, but Colin Powell went to the United Nations and he held up a little bottle of white powder, and he claimed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and he said that there's much anthrax to be found, but that was a complete lie. It was a complete lie what the Americans said, and they went to war. They killed people in Iraq because of that. And so there is Madeleine Albright was asked a question, and there's a video on this, so it's not just my memory. You can go watch the video. There's over 500,000 children that have been killed in this war. Do you think it is worth it? And her response was of a devil. She said, well, it's a high price to pay, but I think it's worth it. It's a Madeleine Albright video where she justifies the war of America with Saddam Hussein and killing all these innocent civilians, and it was all done on the pretext of a lie. Now, remember what I said earlier about what the American government does is they project onto others what they do themselves. So they couldn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. They couldn't find it, but they're building the laboratories themselves. I wouldn't doubt that for a second. And so it's been proven, I believe, like you said, Hunter Biden, $500,000. He's, his laptop, which looks like it's got images of child sex traffic, and maybe not child, I don't even know, but the images that I've seen, there's at least some very immoral and unethical behavior. And if that was anybody else, there would be a lot of mainstream news, but because it's Joe Biden, it's very much suppressed. So in any event, I think probably to, go back to your question, what is their main, what is the real interest of the Biden administration of financing the war in Ukraine? I think they constantly need to keep us distracted. I think if there are biochemical laboratories, they want to hide that. They want to, this may be a silly thing to bring up, but all throughout my childhood and all throughout my young adult and growing, into the age that I am now, the American media and Hollywood, which is influenced by the CIA, has painted Russia as the anti-freedom, anti-American country. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Rocky IV.
Yes.
Okay. So just look at how the Russians were painted in that movie. That's very typical, right? We're told not to view the Russians on par, that they deserve freedom or they deserve, because they live under tyrants. They put up with tyrants. It's a dehumanizing thing by Hollywood and the media. And so they need to keep us distracted. That's why we see these horrific stories of Russian soldiers cutting out the tongues of Ukrainian citizens. I don't believe that for a second, but you hear these stories all the time. And unfortunately, the average American can't rise above some of this propaganda. So I think part of it is to keep us distracted, keep our mind off Hunter Biden's laptop. And if they have built and ran biochemical laboratories, and if they're putting nuclear weapons right on the border of Russia, which I can understand why Putin would be very concerned about that, they don't want that story to get out at all. So I think they are trying to distract us, is my answer to that question.
As you mentioned earlier, it is documented that the son of the current U.S. President, Hunter Biden, invested about $500,000 through a fund controlled by him for the construction of a number of laboratories. But why does the American Democratic Party to continue to deny the existence of Ukrainian labs?
Yeah. So I'm gonna go back to a question that I answered earlier. Why do they continue to deny the existence? So that's just one. I mean, from somebody who's looking at just that one issue, that might be a shocking thing. Like, oh look, there's this incredibly important piece of news that Hunter Biden has funded these laboratories, and it's been proven, and yet nobody's reporting it. But from my perspective, Mira, because I've become so used to the Western media not covering important matters that are of interest to clear-thinking people, it's not a shocking thing for me that they would ignore that story. Let me give you a quick example that we had back when we did the incredible interview where you did a conference on human rights violations.
Yeah.
And one of your Russian fellow journalists asked me the question. They said, Rudy, based on the terrible treatment that happened to Mira, where she was unjustly incarcerated and she was treated so badly, do you think that her situation will help to wake up the American criminal justice system so that we can change our behavior and not do this anymore? And I don't know if you remember my response. I was sad. I was like almost brought to tears. I was like, it's very terrible what the American criminal justice system did to you, Mira. But unfortunately, the only way I can answer that is it's a common thing. I mean, what happened to you? It's common. It's like, it's terrible. It's horrific. Yes, people should be paying more attention to it. But when you ask me, why are they avoiding this story? It's common for them to avoid important stories. They just simply don't report on it. And if you're not a part of the American scene and you don't see this on a regular basis, it can be a shocking thing.
There are photos confirming the connection of American democratic officials with neo-Nazi organizations and groups in Ukraine. Why did the United States, which fought against Nazi Germany during World War II, suddenly decide to support the Ukrainian Nazis?
Okay, that word suddenly I'm going to have a little bit of problem with, because I think they've been supporting Nazis for a long time.
since World War II, actually.
I don't think it's a suddenly situation, and that might be a shocking statement. And again, I realize some of this is shocking to your listeners, but I'm going to refer you to a book called Operation Paperclip. And back in World War II, the United States government willingly and knowingly went and hired and gave safe haven and protected Nazi scientists to bring them to America, and gave them positions of high positions within the government and within their laboratories. And
10,000 people. It was 10,000 people from Germany they brought.
Yes, Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program, brought Nazi scientists, and the author's name is Annie Jacobson. And I'm not making this stuff up. Entire books have been written on it, but she's been interviewed many times. And so what does that tell us, right? It tells us that the people that are running the CIA, the federal government, the people, there's an organization called SCS, and they're the interface between the executive branch and all of the federal layers of government. The SCS never changes. I think it's called Senior Executive Service, and they're made up of corporate leaders all throughout America, and they never change. They always have the same agenda. So why would the federal government like drop all of their ethics, become completely immoral, and ignore all of this heinous crimes that happened in World War II in order to give these Nazi scientists a safe haven to gather their so-called intellectual property, because they have no morals, right? When I say the American government is ran by a bunch of godless, lying, murderous traitors, I'm not exaggerating. And the fact that Operation Paperclip even happened, and we never apologize for that. It's still, it's something that happened, and I believe we continue to work with Nazis, and when it serves our own interest. I believe the government, I believe the World Economic Forum will work with anyone, whether it be Nazis, communists, capitalists, anyone, if it furthers their agenda. They don't care about your core belief system as long as their interests are served. And so that's my answer to that question, is to look into Operation Paperclip.
Thank you. The US State Department, under Biden's leadership, of course, unfairly accused the Soros men of the Russian Federation of committing war crimes on the territory of Ukraine. But when it comes to crimes committed by Americans in the Middle East, no one talks about responsibility. Do you think it's time to make the Biden administration answer for the hundreds of thousands of civilians who were victims of the bombing?
Yeah. Again, that's an incredibly astute question. I'm gonna answer it this way. I want your listeners to go look up Madeleine Albright. I referred to this earlier, where she was asked about the 500,000 children that were bombed by America, and they asked her, "Do you think it was worth it?" And she said, "Yeah, it was a high price to pay, but she thought it was worth it." So why does no one talk about it? And do I think it's time that Americans was held accountable? Right? Yes, I think it's time that Americans be held accountable. The American leadership.
Administration, yeah, leadership. Yeah. We are not talking regular American people. Yeah.
Leadership, and I want to make sure that I always say that. A lot of times the Americans don't have a full grasp on what's going on. They've been inundated with so much propaganda. So I do think that American leadership should be held accountable, but since they have a hegemony on the money systems throughout the world, I think it's going to take either two things. It's going to take a world war, and I don't want to see that happen. I don't think anybody wants to see that happen. Or it's going to take a miracle of God to install new leadership in America. And, you know, in the Bible, justice is a theme that runs all throughout the Bible. And one of my verses that resonates with me, not only in my Christian prison ministry, because I see so much injustice where families are torn apart, innocent people sit decades, sometimes 40 years in prison, even longer. I see innocent people on death row. But there's a verse in Revelation 6:10, and it says, "And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?" The people of the world want justice. In the Bible, justice is an attribute of God Almighty. And so how will that happen? I think we have to be obedient to God. We can't be intimidated by the devil. Schaefer Cox, who's a prisoner that I have a huge admiration for, he said that our fear, which is played upon by the governments and the devil, whenever we act in fear, that's a sweet smell in the nostril of Satan. And that's a powerful thought, that we have to get out and speak the truth with no fear, live a life wholeheartedly absent of fear, and say the truth. And we're not perfect. Sometimes we make mistakes. If I make a mistake, Mira, I hope that I'm the first one to acknowledge it and apologize. But we can't walk around and be intimidated by these governments and these people because they somehow think they're better than the rest of humanity. We have to report the truth and have compassion for other human beings. And I thank you for, you know, the fact that you're so bold in your efforts to interview a variety of people and to seek out the truth and to speak the truth. And I pray that more people do the same.